You say yes a lot. You keep giving and giving and giving until you feel exhausted. And when you do say no, you feel like you've failed and let everyone down. This pattern's called people pleasing. And it's not out of kindness, it's a survival behavior learned early on in life. Today I'm talking to Alana Greco, a psychologist who helps people rebuild their self-worth and stop living for approval. I'm Nick Brax, and this is Move Your Mind, where we help you change your life by changing your mind. And if you look fine on the outside, but you feel lost on the inside, you've come to the right place. This episode will help you change your life by changing your relationship with people pleasing.
People pleasing is one of the most common issues I see in my therapy room. And people pleasing obviously has its origins within childhood and adolescence. Often when we're feeling like we need to be able to overgive in order to receive love and receive that care. So when we talk about these experiences where we feel like, oh, in order to get that love, in order to get that affection, that care, I need to be somebody who overgives. I need to be somebody who doesn't have boundaries. I need to be somebody who overextends myself all the time in order to meet other people's needs, because that will enable me to get love back. So that pattern continues throughout our adolescence into our adulthood, and it's difficult to break. But being able to kind of identify the cycle first, we always say name it first, and then when you name it, you can actually do something about it and implement some strategies to help yourself out. But identification and insight is the key. Yep.
Yeah. And what if someone identifies it and they try and make a change with it and they get negative responses? How do you reconcile that and deal with it when you're getting a negative response, it's triggering you, to then still be able to keep going forward and, okay, I get it, that's not to do with me. It can feel a lot harder than that and make you regress back into that same behavior. I'm sure a lot of people listening can relate to that kind of situation where you've tried to make a change in these areas, but then you get the negative feedback and it just, even subconsciously, when you're trying not to, you fall back into the same patterns.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably where the E component comes in. So self-compassion, is really the key here. So self-compassion is all about how we relate to what happens in our lives. And so, we can, like you say, we can take it on, but we also need to be able to say to ourselves, the perfect way to kind of deal with it is, what would you say to a friend who was feeling that way? So if my friend was feeling this way and feeling like they'd taken it on, how would I deal with that? I'd talk them through it, and I'd say, well, exactly like you're saying, this isn't your experience. This is their experience. And unfortunately, this is where we need to kind of build a bit of a bit of internal strength here to be able to say that it's okay for me to stand up for myself, and it's okay for me to assert my needs, and it's okay for me to be, myself here in this situation and live like sort of, I guess, instead of pleasing these other people, knowing that this is something that you've tried, like you said, to try to do the best that you can. So it is about recognizing that we can't control other people's behaviors. We cannot control other people's emotions. And if we subject ourselves to doing that all the time, then we're going to just be constantly chasing our self-worth, basically chasing, this feeling of being of value, because we're going to say, well, until this person's happy with me, and, I won't be worthy, I'm not good enough. So we do need to draw a bit of a line. And I know that probably sounds harsh, but unfortunately it is the case. And if you do want to build your self-worth.
Because it's a horrible way to live. Otherwise, you can't be living in that state. You can't really you at least can't have peace of mind if you're living in that state. It's going to be so anxiety driving to be just relying on everyone else's emotions needing to align with your own, rather than, just dealing with the uncertainty. So is this all linked to the same thing in terms of, our self-worth, whether it be, we're talking about people pleasing, comparison, feeling like we need to just get our validation from all these external things, that we need to be something bigger to be enough. Is it all sort of linked to the same deeper thing?
Yes. Yep. Essentially. So, if we think about self-worth, it's basically it's a felt sense that we matter. So it's an internal belief that who we are is valuable, regardless of, how productive we are, how others respond to you, what we achieve, all of those kind of factors. So it's basically like an inner quiet knowing. And part of this, what you're reflecting on is that there's often discomfort involved in this process. The discomfort in being authentic and knowing that that's necessary sometimes, and that you won't be liked for it,
Yeah.
and that's okay. We're not striving to be liked. Essentially that's what it comes down to. We're not striving to be liked. So we're,
Yeah. No, totally. Well, how much does that play on your subconscious? Because, we can feel sometimes like we are happy, life's going well, we're getting good results, etc. But, we're doing sort of a version, at least, of what you were talking about before, of what people expect us to do, what your parents expect, etc.
Yeah.
Things are going well, though. You've got all of the things you have, and you're happy to a degree with your life. But if you're not truly being true to yourself, how much does that sort of impact your peace of mind, even if it is a subconscious sort of thing?
Well, I think one of the easy ways to think about this, Nick, is we often do basically like a bullseye kind of chart, if you like, and that's come from The Happiness Trap. If you've heard of that book,
I've read that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so they use basically a framework where there's a bullseye, and we have 4 quadrants, and within those quadrants there's relationships, there's our leisure, there's our personal development, and there's our career and education, if you like. And so within that, we look at where we're sitting on the bullseye in terms of where we're living in alignment with those values, those core values. And so the more we are in line with those core values, the happier we are. So I often find that people who come in, feeling restless, feeling burnt out, feeling like they're just not happy with their day-to-day life, that's happening because they're not in alignment with those values. So does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It really does, yeah.
Basically, that's why we need to make sure that those decisions that we're making all the time are in line with what we want for ourselves and with who we are.
So would it be a good practice to get really clear on your values and have that in the back of your mind for when things come up day to day, to really run it through that filter of, okay, I've been offered this job opportunity, I've been asked to go and, I don't know, go on a trip or do this or do that, whatever the hell it is, putting it through that filter of, okay, does this fit within my values though? And if it doesn't, then you sort of, even if you're feeling pulled to do it, you can make a better decision.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a perfect way to look at it. Yep. So, and this is what I'm talking about this constant reflection. So we need to look at our choices. We need to look at the decisions that we make. We need to look at our routine every day. We need to look at what we're doing with our lives, the path we're taking. And we need to say, does this reflect who I am? Does this reflect my worth? Does this reflect my values? And we want to try and live as much as we can in alignment with that, so that we're at that core of that bullseye.
How much does instant gratification play into that?
That's a good question. So I think, we definitely will do things out of that kind of zone because of the instant gratification, especially because we're looking for that validation, or because we're looking for that hit to know, because this is how we've been programmed, so because we're looking for that, we will often just jerk react and do what's expected of us, because that will feed that part of us that wants to be, whatever it is, respected, cared for, loved, depending on the relationship. So we will often do things on that kind of spur of the moment, because we're not thinking about the filter that you're describing, and yeah, we would definitely engage in those kind of behaviors on the spur of the moment.
And is that also to do with, we're more dopamine addicted than ever now, whether it's jumping on social media, looking at how many likes we get, people using pornography to get an instant hit of gratification, whatever it is, things that we know are not good for us, but we do anyway because it gives us that hit.
Yeah.
That would be sort of in that same category.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think social media is a perfect example because, that's what and that's what drives the algorithm as well. We're looking for the likes, we're looking for the shares, we're looking for the, the saves and all those kind of things. And then when we do get those, we do feel validated. We're like, oh, well, our reel was great or whatever it is. And so that does give us an instant dopamine hit. And so that is problematic because it is a form of validation seeking, because we're going, oh, someone else has said that that's great. And so, now I'm worthy, now that video is deemed good or, something that can be shared or that people want to share. And so, yeah, absolutely. It's our society is encouraging these behaviors that actually go against us building that strong sense of self-worth. And so it is difficult to build, when you do have this kind of things happening in your life all the time where you like you say, on social media. But, even just in a relationship, you might be texting with somebody and, when they text back, you get that hit of dopamine. If they don't hit back, you get that hit, against your self-worth, and you think, oh, well, I'm not worthy enough, or they haven't taken the time for me, or, and it's difficult for us to kind of rationalize that in our brain and say, well, no, there's a million other reasons why this could be happening, and it's not a reflection of our worth.
Absolutely.
So yeah, absolutely. It's definitely the dopamine hit is definitely one of the problems in building our self-worth in today's world.
Yeah, it's tricky. And I guess it can be a curse if someone, before they've really been able to do that personal development work, or is it harder if, you had, I don't know what an example would be, like someone becoming, I don't know, a TikTok star for posting maybe not quite degrading images, but, things that aren't very fulfilling. You're known, you become this big star for something that doesn't have a lot of meaning behind it, but you're getting all of this validation. Well, not only validation, it becomes your career. Then you're on that treadmill, and that's just what you do now. Yep. But then deep down, something feels off, and now you're stuck on that path. That must be a very tricky thing to navigate when you're on it, because there's so many levels to it at that point. That's your living, and you maybe got other people employed in what you're doing, and that's become your livelihood, but you haven't even had a chance to question what you actually care about. And
that absolutely happens. I'm familiar with a number of people who that's happened to, and exactly as you've described it, unfortunately. And yeah, essentially that they've basically been on this treadmill that you describe, and so they're creating content that is, not in alignment with who they are. And so, I mean, moving forward with that, I would encourage those people to, stop and have a think about that content, and perhaps, think, is this something I want to be doing, for the next, X years? Because like you say, once you're on that treadmill, it's difficult to get off. Or is there a way I can pivot towards, something that is more aligned with who I am and with what I want to be doing, and, with a purpose that I want to be achieving? And how can I perhaps bring that in, maybe in small increments, for the beginning, and move your audience towards it? And I think what you need to be really okay with there, Nick, is losing followers. And I've seen many people say that's happened. They've started to perhaps express an opinion, or they've started to go down a different path, or they've realized that this is not the content that they want to create anymore. And they've said, I lost 10,000 followers, but the 10,000 followers is the cost of you being able to live in alignment with your values and essentially be a happier person and move towards, a purpose that you are aligned with and that will bring you joy. And so I would say that the loss of those followers would be worth, that alignment.
You can't quantify it. It's not, there's not a number you can put on the value of being able to be true to yourself and live in alignment, have peace of mind.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
is that why we see a lot of, whether it's celebrities,
Mm-hmm.
billionaires, etc., that are, I mean, in the most extreme cases, suicide, but, drug problems, depressed, addictions, etc.,
Yep.
when these are the people that society told us that we're meant to strive. They're the, like, literally the pinnacle of what we're told we're meant to reach, but then they're not happy a lot of the time.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and unfortunately, I think that's what drives them to become so depressed, because it really is the key. It's the key to being happy, and we might reflect on this a bit more later. But the key to being happy is living in alignment with your values. And the important thing to remember is that as things happen in our life, they may change, and it's important not to hold on to what you previously valued because you think that's where you should be.
Yeah.
So yeah, you might, for example, have kids now, and so you might decide that instead of working, I don't know, 50-hour weeks or something like that, that you might decide that you want to be more, at home. You might want to do a split, being in the office and at home, working less hours. You might want to be able to go to the kids' football game, all those kind of things. And so your values are going to change. And so you need to be okay with changing your life and, your routines and basically everything about your life, to continue to live in alignment with what you value, because they will change. They will absolutely change. And that's normal. I've got clients who have relationships where they've, started the relationship quite young and the values were different then. And then they find it difficult to leave the relationship later in life because they say, oh, well, we've been together for X years, but it's unfortunately they have realized that their values have significantly changed over that time and that they might not be aligned with their partner or anymore. And so it's difficult, really difficult for them to let go of that. And so it is a big move to be able to do this. And it takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of, will to be able to do this, and you need to be okay with sitting in the discomfort of doing that as well.
So it's like the sunk cost fallacy, that the more time that passes where you've really attached yourself to, if you've been in that relationship, the time investment, if you've been on a path where you're striving to achieve or be something, the harder it is to leave because you've put such an investment into it. Then how do you justify all of that time going into it? And then even more so, like we were saying before, how on earth do you do it when not only that investment's gone into it, but you've actually had incredible results?
Yes.
It's like, well, every fiber of your being's telling you don't do that. When your emotions are so attached to it. But if you're knowing, it's tricky. It's like golden handcuffs where probably what is the real thing for you, but you're so scared to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so this is what we were saying before with the identity being tied up within that. But when when we're reflecting on people who are, feeling so depressed and they end up suiciding, or, they end up in these spaces where, that they might fall out. You often see movie stars that just disappear from the screen, and you kind of never really see them again. But, where have they gone, So it's a question of, I think, have they kind of remained within that frame of mind that they need to be a movie star and then kind of haven't been able to move forward with that and change? Or is it, have they been able to potentially change into a career? Or, we often see people who move, I think, change, they might go from, like, I guess for you, for example, Nick, you've done a lot of things, you've done a lot of modeling, you've done a lot of TV, and so now you've moved into this space where you're incredibly passionate about fitness and about health and about well-being. And, you really moved into a space where I think, you've created quite an amazing, space for people to learn and grow, around your topic, and so, like you've said, that's been an experience for you to kind of grow on that journey, I think. And so you've been able to, I don't know if the word is let go, but you've been able to move forward and recognize where you want to be And so even though, you did feel intense pressure to be within those, kind of really public, roles, you've been able to move forward into a space that you're very passionate about now. And so, yeah, it does take a lot of guts, is probably the best way to put it, to be able to move to a space where you are happy.
It's interesting, yeah. And yeah, I was going to talk about my own experience with it, because what comes up for me is we get so attached to an emotion that we felt at a certain age. Because I know if I look at my whole sort of path I've been on, I fell into the mental health work quite early, but then I also, while I was still very much discovering who I was, had low self-esteem, I was wound up doing modeling work on TV shows, etc., getting validation through that, deciding I wanted to be an actor, going down that path. While doing all of that, having this through line of continued work in the mental health advocacy space, and that just came naturally, and that was what I could feel, like, okay, this is my calling. But as time went on, I kept staying, even though I felt like the path was sort of, falling in place for me, there was that attachment to the emotion that I felt in my early 20s of this, like a drug, the validation that being an actor is going to give, though. That's going to be the be-all, end-all. And I have to still try and do that. And even though I was thinking, yeah, but okay, if it happens, great, but even if it happened, that's not the thing that's actually going to give me, it can't give me anywhere near as much meaning as what I'm already doing and what's in front of me. But there's such a pull of that emotion. It's so difficult to, I guess it's like what you were talking about. It takes so much courage to go against those things that pull us in these different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think what you're talking about also is that we're in that kind of time in our lives, we're chasing this approval in order to feel secure. But the approval that we're chasing within those positions is only ever really temporary, so we often, people will end up chasing harder, chasing faster, but because it's only temporary, they're just kind of in that cycle, and it will just keep resetting. So they never actually feel secure within themselves because they're just chasing that approval within those positions. So it again comes down to not having, the self-trust, to not having the boundaries, and to not acting authentically.
Because you're just, I mean, if you look at acting as an example, I guess, like, you could have success and you have a movie that comes out and it goes really well, and everyone's, everyone's hearing your name and giving you validation, and you might get another offer, and then things dry up, and then you're panicking, and then you're not able to, look at it and think, what, how amazing was that I had that experience happen. Maybe it'll happen again, maybe not, but what, this is great. And what else can I focus on? It's more like, no, unless I can actually now get to the next level and stay relevant, I'm not enough. I'm a loser. I'm a piece of shit. It's like, it's crazy where your mind can go, and it's just so out of reality, out of touch with reality. But it's, is it also a breeding ground? Because, we now live in a world where, in the past, that example would have been applicable to very specific areas, whether like an entertainer in these realms. Now it's applicable to almost anyone who's operating on social media. You're doing mini versions of that. So it's really just your self-worth trying to come out in the validation.
Well, yeah. So I think one of the things you picked up on there, Nick, is that we don't stop to appreciate our, the small wins, if you like, that we have in our lives. And what you're describing is probably more of a big win, if you like. But yeah, we don't stop to appreciate those things. So we get on this treadmill and we just keep going, and we go, give me more, because I need to feed that. And that's, again, that dopamine hit that you're talking about as well. And so, yeah, you end up, basically wanting just to have that validation in order to feel like you are someone.
Yeah. So have we completely just got it wrong with how we've decided in society to define what success is? Because if we changed it and flipped it, that success is peace of mind and Talking about values, being true to my values and being able to look myself in the mirror and know I'm enough, then it'd be a very different world, wouldn't it? We'd be striving for different things if that was what success was, and everything else was secondary to that. Whether you become the biggest movie star in the world or the richest person or whatever it is, that's still, but on a public level, was not seen as impressive as the other version. I feel like the world would be so different. If you're listening to this and you want to make a change in your life but you don't know where to begin, I've created a free Move Your Mind masterclass that walks you through how to build sustainable habits and make change that really sticks. And you'll also get access to a free weekly newsletter where I post practical tools and stories that I don't share anywhere else. To watch the free masterclass, head to go.nickbrax.com/moveyourmind. That's go.nickbrax.com/moveyourmind. You can also find the link in the show notes.
Yep, absolutely. So you spot on there. So yeah, we definitely define success in the wrong way in society. So like you've said, but our success is, I think we each define it differently. But it is ultimately, like you say, around, people recognizing our efforts. So success is very achievement based. It's very role based. It's very, what society values rather than what we value. And so I think that's probably the distinguishing factor. We need to have more of a focus on, what we value and what we define as success, And again, that's something I think that will change as, your life progresses as well. I feel
Absolutely.
Like my definition of success has changed as well, a lot. So it will depend on your lifestyle, it will depend on, relationships. So it will depend on what stage you're at in your career. It will just, it depends on various factors. But absolutely, we need to redefine success so that it is more of an individualized success, and we need to anchor that more internally rather than something that people are going to be like, you did great. It's okay to want, a bit of approval, like to have that, a bit of approval. It's okay to want that, but we want it to complement ourselves. So we don't want to be entirely dependent upon others. I'm not saying it's not great to have somebody say, oh, you did a great job on that. We are human. It's okay to have these moments, but we want to be able to not rely on that. We need to be able to have that sense of self anchored internally.
Yeah, exactly. I guess if I would, a good example, like with the podcast, I can very easily start looking at all of these bigger podcasts and I want to now be on that level. I want to compete with them, and how do I get there and why am I not there? Yep. So you can have that healthy, well, I guess this is my question. Can you have that healthy goal of, I want to grow it, I want to strive to get a bigger audience, to help more people, to get to there, but I'm not going to, regardless of whether that happens or not, I'm still going to just enjoy the process of doing it while striving. So have that sort of middle ground where you're working towards it, but you're not letting that take away from your joy and commitment. Sorry, your joy out of what you get out of the process of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it is hard. I'm not going to say it's not. It's there's people out there with 1 million followers and things like that, and it's hard not to compare yourself to them. But at the same time, it is about, and I think this is where that rational kind of brain needs to come in sometimes. We need to kind of remind ourselves that the algorithm is not always our friend. And it's hard to kind of do that as well, but it is a factor in social media. But yeah, absolutely. What you're saying is that, having this idea that it's okay to have, that middle ground, and that there's that gray, if you like, not black or white. We're not either no good or we're great. We're in that kind of gray, and it's okay to be in that gray. And I think even just reminding yourself sometimes that it takes time to build these things is really important, because I have a lot of people say to me, I want to build social media, but I want to be, up there straight away. And it's it doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
And so it needs, we need to be okay with this building process. But what it comes down to also is that no time is lost time, and what we need to, this is one of the things that I always talk about as well with my clients, and that's about growth. I'm very growth oriented. We need to make sure that we're always working with this growth perspective. We're learning. Each time you do a podcast, you're learning. Each time I do a post, I'm learning. Each client that sits in my room, I'm learning. I'm a very different psychologist to what I was 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It's okay for the growth to be slow at times. It's okay for things to be happening in our lives that maybe delay growth a little bit or slow it down. So we need to be kind of okay with the process and just have this mindset that as long as you're working towards it and you feel like you're working towards your passion and you have purpose every day, you get up every morning and you help people to learn about their health and their mental health. And so, I always say if we can change one person, we've made a huge change to the world, And so,
Totally.
And so it's, social media is one of those things where, obviously we have the capacity to reach an enormous audience. And hopefully that's something that we'll build eventually. But if we're okay with helping one person, if we're okay with one person, liking that post, that's all we need to be okay with, and the other thing I think you need to remember is that, obviously with social media, just in general, I try and tell all my patients this, is that, people don't often express their likes, for might be fear of judgment, or it might be, unfortunately, everybody knows what you like and don't like on social media, there's literally a button that shows you if somebody's liked this post. So, sometimes people like to be, quiet about what they like, and that's okay, but it's not a reflection of your worth. So people might be getting value out of your podcast, out of your, posts, but not showing it online. And so, we need to remember all of these kind of factors, I think, because they are important in us continuing to, put out the content, and keep on our journeys, if you like. But yeah, I think purpose is the goal. If you feel like you're heading in the direction of your purpose, then you will be happy and you'll be achieving the right things, so to speak.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And you're not, the irony is, if you can be on that purpose and do it for the right reasons and not be swayed by how many likes or followers or validation or whatever it is,
Yep.
you're probably, or almost certainly, more likely to actually get closer to that desired outcome anyway. Because, I mean, I look at podcasts, I think 99% of podcasts quit before episode 13 or whatever number it is, like something very low. And probably because it takes a long time. You're getting that validation early on, and then it's like, okay, is it worth it? You stop before you can even give it a chance.
Yep.
So if you can remove caring about that side and focus on, I love what you said, waking up every day. Okay, how can I just, help add value to the world, interview someone about mental health, get a message out there. Maybe it'll help one person, maybe not even one person, who knows? But how good is this that I get to do that? The rest can sort itself out, at least then you're living in alignment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's spot on. And so, that's something that I do each day. I wake up and I've moved into this space of self-worth and created Elevate Your Worth. And so that is my goal. My goal is to basically help people to see first that low self-worth can prevent them from, heading in the direction that they want to be heading in, and to make the decision to change some of their behaviors so that they can start to build that to head into the direction of their purpose, and feel confident in doing that, and not worry about being cringe, or not worry about, all of the factors, and not worrying about potentially failing or anything like that. Because I think
it's so important.
I see much more depression and anxiety when people are not following their purpose. And so we need to look at the cost of that. So, do we put ourselves out there, and do we give it a go, even if we're not confident, even if we're cringe, even if we're all of these factors, that people come up with, that, the barriers to prevent them from engaging. It's not just social media. It's starting a business. It's, engaging in, a new relationship. It's all the aspects of our life. Engaging in a hobby. You might say, oh, I don't want to do this because I've always wanted to be a dancer, but I don't want to go to a dance class because I look like an idiot. We need to kind of go, well, I'm holding myself back from that, and I'm not living in alignment with what I want to be doing because I'm so fearful of what other people are going to think of me. And so this is what I'm saying about, like, the small things in life. We don't realize just how important self-worth is. And so to me, I literally, I think it's almost like a two-directional thing. There's low self-worth and there's high self-worth. And so they're going to lead you on two completely different paths in life. And so they will be, if you like, it's like a sliding doors moment, or, the factor that determines the decisions that you make, And so we go, okay, well, I'm not afraid of these things, so I'm going to do this. Or we say, I am afraid of these things, and so I'm going to let that impact me, and I'm not going to do this. And so, yeah, it literally is two different pathways in your life, and it's determined by low or high self-worth.
It's like a sliding doors sort of moment. You can choose which one you want to go with, and yeah, they really do lead to vastly different. It's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. So it's vastly different outcomes in your life.
Self-worth is, I think, one of the biggest topics. Like, it's such a big thing.
Yeah.
And it's a hard thing to manage. We put so much pressure on ourselves. We feel so much pressure. Society tells us that we should be all of these different things, to the point where we almost don't even give ourselves a chance to sit and think about who we actually want to be. And there can be so much conflict when we're trying to be something that we don't even want to be.
Yep.
Your self-esteem and self-worth really just falls apart. I think it's a tricky thing.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest concerns that people have is that their self-worth gets tied up in the roles that they play, and, the roles that we establish as children in our lives. And so, for example, you might be the good child, or you might be the overachiever, or you might even just really identify with the particular career that you have. So, you might be the high-performing lawyer or something like that. And so your entire identity just becomes encompassed within that role. And then it becomes difficult for you to, find yourself outside of that should anything change in your life. For example, our values, one of the biggest things that impacts our self-worth is, and that we don't actually think about a lot, is that our values change as we age, and just as life progresses generally. And I think that a lot of the issues that we have with our identity is related to this kind of values misalignment, and it's because we get tied up within those roles.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's such a dangerous thing to do, and we all fall into it. But you talk a lawyer or whatever it is. Yeah. If you're attached to that identity, things are inevitably going to have ups and downs. Absolutely. So you're setting yourself up for failure in the sense that you are going to really struggle and question a lot of things, and be in a pretty bad way when things aren't going your way. And it's like not a very nice way to live, to be just, you're so vulnerable to outcomes that you can't even control.
Yeah, absolutely. And often we get involved in these particular, roles, or due to, whether it be prestige, whether it be family pressures, whether it be, following in family footsteps, anything like that. We often fall into something because we think it's the right thing to do. And then that leads us to basically become quite burnt out, unhappy, restless, and it starts to lead to other issues within your life.
Yeah. I mean, how do you navigate that, especially at a young age? I guess if I use my own example, I had family pressure, yes, but more so pressure I put on myself because of my family, growing up with my dad being the Premier of Victoria. And I mean, to this day, because it was such a big part of my life from when I was 12 till early 20s, he was in that position. Everyone knew who our family was. Yeah. We were in the media. I ended up having a media career. and I was referred to as the son of this person. So all it did to me was make me feel like I need to prove myself. I need to be something. I need to be, do something equally as big, if not bigger than my dad, so I can be known as Nick Braxton.
Yeah.
It really, it destroyed me. And it's something that still, I have to be really conscious of it, because I can allow that to destroy my sense of self, my self-esteem, my enjoyment in day-to-day life, because I can easily go through a series of thought patterns and tell myself that nothing that I'm doing is good enough, because if it's not bigger than being the premier of Victoria, then is it actually worth it? And that's just a shocking, it's not even logical, because you can't compare all these different things. But
Absolutely.
it's an extreme example, I think, but I think we all go through it. Like, how do we improve with, how do we sort of set ourselves up to not fall into these patterns?
Well, so I think what you're kind of reflecting on, if you like, is basically that your worth is being tied to a sense of external approval. So you become trapped in this cycle of measuring yourself against really quite impossible standards, and then, you're doing what other people expect of you, rather than what, Nick truly wants to do, And so what we need to do is, when it comes to this idea of breaking the cycle of, it's what we're talking about is that our value isn't up for debate, essentially what it comes down to. So we want to make sure that our life reflects who we are, not who we're trying to impress, and so we don't want our worth tied to that external approval, and we don't want to have to feel like, our purpose is defined by who we are, by what we do, not who we are, so that is the distinguishing factor. We need to make sure that we define ourselves by who we are rather than what we're doing. So
the value is already there. You're choosing to live by a mindset that you've already decided that you've got value, and that value can't get any higher.
Yeah.
Because that's innately, you're enough already. You can't increase that. You can increase what you achieve or what you do, or maybe things that bring you excitement or challenge or whatever it is, but the value already being there, which is a hard thing to get your head around sometimes, because
absolutely,
even though it's logical, and I can tell myself that, but I still deep down, even with all the work I've done on myself, don't feel like I'm valuable enough unless I do all these things. I want more, and it's a hard thing to get clear on. And I think so many people probably, if there's a spectrum of it, I feel like everyone, unless they're so enlightened, is somewhere on that spectrum where they're feeling like they need to prove themselves.
Yeah, and you're spot on. I think one of the easy ways to think about it, or simplest ways, I guess, is that, when a baby's born, we don't sit there and say, well, let's wait and see if you become a good person before we decide if you need care, or before we decide if you deserve care, is more so,
Yeah.
We feed them, we protect them, we soothe them, and it's not because they've done something to deserve it. It's because being human is what makes them worthy of that care and that safety and that dignity. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah.
And so if that worth exists on day one, it doesn't just vanish because life gets more complicated. And so, that is what we need to remember. But it's, unfortunately, as, we develop, we go through experiences, we experience, perhaps traumatic events or just general parenting, essentially, life experience that we go through, we forget that. We just start to move towards a place where we're just constantly achieving, we're constantly competing, and we're doing all that in order to feel worthy. And it's not, what we need to do is we need to anchor that self-worth internally. And so we need to do that by validating ourselves. And that's a core aspect of the framework that I've developed. And so, it is about basically, putting a stop to this idea of saying to people, I'm going to hand you the power to determine whether I'm worthy or not. to determine whether I'm of value or not. And so, that is the key factor. Yeah. So, that we all have needs, and, the needs that we have are things like to feel safe, to feel seen, to feel, connected, to feel like we belong. And we're worthy of all of those things. We're deserving of all of those things. We don't need to do anything in order for those things to, for those things to happen for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And what a liberating feeling to have, to be truly living in that state where you can, look yourself in the mirror, tell yourself you're enough, and truly feel inside you that no one has control over whether you are or are not enough other than yourself, because you already know that you are. That's a amazing feeling, but it's so much easier done in practice than reality, because if we lived in an ideal world, we wouldn't have all of this exposure to just daily, the way we're raised, schooling, society, everything telling us that we should do this, we should do that, capitalism trying to sell us on all of these different idealisms. Yeah. It's unavoidable. Like, even if you're raised in the perfect sort of, in the best way possible to become centered in that way, the world is going to expose you to so much information and so many, trials and tribulations that you're gonna fall into some of these patterns.
Yeah. And I guess I want to get clear here that I don't think that this is easy at all. I think you're spot on. And so this is I guess why I've created the framework. So, I mean, self-worth is really quite an abstract concept, if you like. And so what it's about is it's really about showing yourself that you matter. And so if you're okay with it, we'll go through some of the framework now.
Please,
yeah. So my framework is called the BRAVE framework. So it's boundaries, it's R is recognizing your inherent worth, A is authenticity, V is validating yourself, and E is empathy, but it's empathy for yourself. So it also encompasses the component of self-compassion. So as part of these, what these will do if you continue to practice them, and it is a daily practice. So, like, I'm not saying that this is going to be something that comes overnight. And that's why I really want to help people to do this, because it's a continual reminder. We need to make sure that our daily routine, we need to make sure that the decisions that we make, we need to make sure that everything we do, within our week, and, what we can do to do that is reflect on that. So we can stop and say, have the decisions that I've made today reflected, my self-worth, have they reflected who I am, authentically, so it's all of these kind of, it is really an ongoing practice. So in terms of boundaries, there's actually 4 different types of boundaries, and it's not something we generally think about, but we often think of boundaries just as, when we're overextended, we'll say no, so I feel tired, I don't want to go out tonight. I don't want that person to come over because, they upset me, I'll say no. Whatever it is, anything like that, but that's just a very basic boundary, if you like. So we do that. That's what we refer to as an external boundary. But then there's also internal boundaries. And so internal boundaries are the ones that it's about not taking responsibility for others' feelings. So often we can assume responsibility for other people's feelings. So, for example, and I know I've done this before, Nick, I've gone out to dinner with people, and I've picked a restaurant, and I sit there thinking, I hope that they're going to be okay with this restaurant. I hope that the food's going to be okay. And I hope they're going to come away saying this was fantastic, but they might not. And so you can often take that on, you can take on this kind of, this anxiety and this fear of, and then that can, lead you to feel self-doubt and criticize yourself, or you shouldn't have done that, or why did I, what was I thinking, and go down, quite a negative, critical path, so we need to have internal boundaries there. So not taking responsibility for other people's feelings, regardless of the situation. Another one is our emotional boundaries. So emotional boundaries are, and especially for me as a psychologist, this, I guess, might be an easy way to kind of talk about it, is I need to not absorb other people's emotional experiences, so, and, you might be like this with a friend. You might be sitting there and they might be having a really difficult time. And we need to make sure that we're able to empathize with them and reflect with them and support them through the experience without actually absorbing that emotional experience. So you can witness the emotion, but you don't internalize the emotion. And so that's another boundary we need to set. And the final boundary is mental boundaries. And so mental boundaries are really important for authenticity. And so these are the ones where we can allow ourselves to think differently from others, but we know that our perspective is still really valid, even if someone else disagrees. So I don't know if you've been in a situation where you feel like, oh, I can't say that, or, I don't want to express myself because other people will disagree and that will look, bad on me, basically. And so we need to be able to make sure that we can feel okay in doing that. And know that that's okay, because that will help us to act authentically in our relationships. But often we're so fearful of other people's responses and reactions that we don't act authentically. And if we don't, behave in an authentic way, then we're going to not be able to rebuild that self-worth. So
and it's not,
that's the boundaries component.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, all of those, I think there's so much to dive into there, and all of those are so important. And I think all of us fall into, at different times, each of those 4 points that you're talking about there. And it's really tricky. And, people pleasing sort of comes up for me when you're talking about a lot of that. And if I think I've just fallen into that so many times, where you're terrified about hurting someone else, about making the wrong choice if they're not having a good experience, like you're talking about at the restaurant, and then really, feeling this very, strong emotion based on what they are or are not feeling. And it's very confusing, because I think the natural thing is thinking that's because you're being a good, caring person. But it is good to care about trying to give someone a good experience, but then it doesn't mean you're a good person because you're feeling, you're beating yourself up and tying yourself up in knots about it. But it's tricky, because it's sort of, so it's to do with how self-assured you are, I guess, like, of knowing you've done your best, you've tried to put, to give someone a good experience, or whatever the situation is, and then outside of that, that's not my problem anymore. If they want to complain about it, well, okay, I'm not going to take on that emotion, because I know I've done my part. What got you into this area? What made you in the first place go down the path that you've gone down?
So I guess, I mean, if I was to think about my childhood, my life, I think I really was someone who dimmed the parts of me that were actually my strengths, and I did that in order to be accepted, so, but I knew internally that it was my energy, my passion, my intensity, my drive, I knew that they were the things that would help me to move forward and be able to pursue the goals that I wanted to pursue. But I wasn't able to do that. I wasn't able to overcome that, because I felt like I needed to wait for permission to do that. I needed to feel like, I felt like I wasn't enough. I felt like I needed to mold myself. So, but now I know that that's not the case. Now I know that, you naturally attract the right people, the right opportunities and the right path when you are yourself. And so, now I'm no longer dimming, essentially, and so, that's basically what's put me on this path. And I can identify, significant decisions in my life that I've made based on low versus high self-worth, and it really has set my path on, a different trajectory. I probably would have been here much sooner had I, had the guts to be able to face all of these things, and not seek out that validation earlier.
Yeah.
So personally, that's, I guess, what set me on the path. I guess from a professional perspective, I really see it within my clients. I can see that it's essentially a bit of a compass for them, and so it's a guiding decision whether they go this way or that way is entirely dependent upon how they feel about themselves and whether or not they feel okay about, giving something a go at the cost of, what they'll look like to the outside world.
Yeah, that's powerful. It's relevant to all of us, what you're talking about. It really is.
Yeah.
It's so important.
Yeah. And so I think, also one of the other big factors is that I think we're quite, just as a society, we're quite disconnected from ourselves. So we don't know, because we don't know who we are beyond these kind of things, the roles that we perform, we don't know ourselves. We end up building lives that don't fit who we are, And so, yeah, that's what leads to feeling unhappy. We think, as long as we look fine from the outside, as long as we're keeping up with the Joneses, we're okay. But inside we're not okay, So, but then the problem with that is we can often it often leads to other factors like substance use. You might just be scrolling all day, you might be an overachiever, you might be someone who just keeps busy in order to keep distracted from your purpose, because you feel like, that's what you need to do. You just feel like you can't go down the path that you need to go down. So, yeah, that disconnection from self is really a key factor in our mental health.
It's a huge one. I think, yeah, that would be even a whole podcast episode in itself on that topic. Mm-hmm. It's a massive one. And we're talking before we started recording about how when people are in that state, you're less likely to go and do things that are healthy for you. You don't have that motivation, and then your self-esteem goes down further, and then you're even less likely. So we need to take action, breaking that cycle, and whether it is just getting moving, doing a bit of exercise or eating a little bit better, getting more sleep, whatever the area is, it can be so difficult to do it when you're stuck in that negative cycle. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And so, I've just generally noticed, it's about how much you believe you're worth caring for, and so if people have low self-worth, they tend to neglect themselves. So they don't feel like they deserve attention, rest, nourishment, so they'll do things like ignore their nutrition. They'll ignore, the need to get good sleep. They'll avoid exercise, they'll dismiss their mental health needs. And so, the self-care is actually a reflection of your self-worth. And so, if we can recognize that self-care, if we can recognize the self-worth, we can then identify self-care as essentially self-respect, rather than as something that we have to do, rather than like a chore. So you're basically saying, to the world, to yourself, I matter, my health matters, my life matters. So yeah, it's self-care is a practice of your inherent value.
It's such an important point. I mean, that's a really powerful way to reframe it, because I think if people think of it in that way, you're going to behave so differently. Like if you're really looking at it, okay, do I respect myself? Well, it's pretty hard hitting. It makes you really have to reflect and think, okay, well, I don't. You can't really lie to yourself when you put it through that framework. So I think we need more people talking about that, because yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we often overwork, we'll push past exhaustion, but by doing all those things, you're basically saying to yourself that your needs aren't important. And, if you go the other way, the more you care for yourself, the more your nervous system actually internalizes that you're worthy. So then, the other behaviors will follow, because when you kind of start to tell yourself you're worthy and that you're going to invest in yourself, you'll find it easier to set boundaries. You'll find it easier to kind of shift decisions in your best interests. So those decisions will start to become easier because you're actually, setting up your body and your nervous system to say, I am worthy, I am deserving, I deserve all of this care, and yeah, we need to focus on this as part of our self-worth and self-care each day.
I love it. Well, love everything you've shared here. We finish every episode with 5 closing questions.
Mm-hmm.
So these can be sort of whatever answer comes to mind for you. First one being, what's your best childhood memory that comes to mind?
Childhood memory. I guess I grew up in Bacchus Marsh. I don't know if you know where that is.
I do.
Okay, yeah. It was a small country town, not so small anymore. But yeah, we had a hobby farm. So on that hobby farm, I had numerous animals. We had, some sheep, some goats, but we also had lots of like little animals like rabbits and guinea pigs and cats and dogs and things like that. And I guess for me, it was really about just coming home from school each day and just being with them. So I would do all sorts of things. I would dress them up. I would literally, I would put, human clothes on them. I would just play with them, just hold them, I'd feed them, nurse them, whatever needed to be done. I would do what was necessary. And so I guess just being present with them. And I guess when I think about it from a perspective of, I was quite an anxious child. So that realistically for me was, something that grounded me, and helped me to kind of feel, I guess at ease with them and helped me to regulate. It's probably the best way to put it. So yeah, being able to just be present with all of my animals, that was my thing. And I guess it probably hasn't changed now. I think I'm the same when I'm outdoors.
Right.
When I'm in an open space and around animals, I feel far more regulated. So yeah, probably a weird one, but it's
a good one, a good example. We can all take something out of that and spend more time with animals. It's a good way to stay present. I like it.
Yeah. So yeah.
What do you think's currently the biggest burden on mental health in society?
I mean, social media is probably one, but I think that, like we said, that's a double-edged sword, because I think that also provides a lot of opportunity. So, but I definitely think it can have a negative impact in terms of comparison, validating ourselves, all of those factors I've already talked about, and so it can really lead us to start to measure ourselves against really impossible standards and people who, nothing like us. And we start thinking, oh, well, we're not enough compared to them. And so, yeah, I think social media is a big one. But like I said earlier, also that disconnection from yourself, which when we have that identity tied up within those roles that we perform and we don't actually know who we truly are, that leads us to kind of build that life that doesn't really fit who we are.
Yeah, it's huge. And I'd say 95% of the guests I've had on have said social media. It's a big one.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
What would you say is your personal definition of happiness?
I mean, I think we've touched on it a bit, but it's a sense that your life fits you. That the choices you make, the relationships you have, the work that you engage in, the boundaries you implement, that they all reflect who you actually are and not who you think you're supposed to be.
Yeah, so that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. I think it's about our behavior matching our truth and not our fear.
I love that. If you could go back in time and give one piece of advice to your 18-year-old self, what would that be?
Like I said earlier, don't mold yourself to be accepted. Yep. 100%.
Powerful.
Yep. Don't give yourself, don't think, oh, I need to be skinnier, I need to be quieter, I need to be less too much. I think that's a common one. Really, just being very mindful that who I was okay. And I would probably also, tell myself to, like I said, get my butt into gear sooner and just, to get going and start sooner. Because, I mean, I initially saw a motivational speaker in year 10, and I absolutely loved the work that he was doing. And I said to myself then and there, I can still remember it was in the school library, I said to myself then and there, this is my purpose. Like, I'm so passionate about this. I've always been really passionate about empowering others and, helping others to be the best they can be and to achieve their potential and realize what their potential was. And so I knew then and there, at 15, that's what I wanted to do. but here I am now, starting a year ago to really move on that path. And yeah, so I really would have loved to have started that earlier.
But you know what? It's like my favorite saying is life's what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. And you sort of reflect and, all of those things. Maybe if that didn't happen, you wouldn't have this wealth of experience to bring to the work you're doing now if you went into it earlier, or who knows. But I feel like everything connects the dots where, as long as we end up where we're meant to be, some of these other experiences add to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And now, like when I run my workshops, I can, basically, give a wealth of experience to, all the participants based on my life experience, exactly what you're describing. And so had I not had that, 15 years in clinical psychology, I wouldn't have case study examples. I wouldn't have the lived experience myself. So yeah, you're absolutely spot on. Yeah. So it's given me a wealth of knowledge and wisdom. So absolutely. And I reflected on that earlier. So I'm calling myself out here.
There you go.
It's no time is ever wasted. Yeah.
Yep. You're exactly where you're meant to be. And I think it's like if you were sitting here saying, as we talked about in this, that you were not in alignment with yourself and you were doing something against your values, that's different. But, like we talked about, that's sort of the filter that we can take out of this episode. You put it through those filters to try and understand whether you are or are not living in alignment.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Well, final one, what are you most proud of?
Probably my children. So I guess my kids, if I think about the idea of, we've heard the saying, if you can be anything in this world, be kind. My children are incredibly kind. They, not at the cost of, not a self-sacrificing, people-pleasing kindness, but they are definitely very kind children. And also, they do know their worth. So I'm very proud of that. And I guess if you, think about what I was just talking about earlier, that I think, I'm very much trying to instill in them that, from an early age to build that self-worth. And, they often see me doing videos for my Instagram page, and they'll often also pick up on my behaviors. So, if just like before I say something like, oh, I can't believe I did that. What a silly thing to do. They'll be the first ones to say, Mum, stop, that's not helping you. You're being self-critical and, you're not being compassionate. And so, yeah, having three little amazing humans who have that knowledge early on, I'm incredibly proud of them, and seeing these messages get carried forward in that way, I guess it's the greatest indicator that, the work that I'm doing is meaningful.
I love that. Yeah, no, well, thank you for sharing everything on here. And final thing, where can our listeners go if they want to learn more about you?
So I've got my website, elevateyourworth.com.au. So if you want to do either one-on-one coaching or workshops, I've got a workshop coming up in February here in Melbourne. Also, I've got my Instagram page, so elevateyourworth_psychology.
Amazing.
Yep.
We'll have that in the show notes. So make sure to check those out. And Alana, thank you so much. Thank you for bringing all of your knowledge into this interview. I've taken a huge amount out of this, and I know our listeners will, and you've got so many great insights to share. So I think the work you're doing is so important. The topics that you're talking about are just essential to, what so many people are going through. So I really appreciate you making the time to have this chat.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a great opportunity.
And thank you for listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the episode and any topics you'd like to hear about. Feel free to leave a comment or send me a DM. Your feedback is always appreciated. It would mean the world to me if you can subscribe to my channel, leave a like or comment, share it with your friends. It makes a world of difference. It doesn't cost anything, and it helps me to get this show bigger and better and bring on the guests and the production value that you ask for every single week. I couldn't do it without you guys. Thank you so much.